It's good, Mom. You're gonna be okay. It's gonna be, they're very supportive.
Like you were the child when they were.
I was the child. And then
From forgotten to unstoppable. She was barely 7 months old, starving and silent, in a crumbling orphanage half a world away. Her name unknown, her future already slipping through the cracks. 18 years later, that same child would walk the red carpet in a couture gown once worn by a Hollywood queen. And not just wear it, but own it. This isn't a fairy tale, it's the real-life story of Zahara Jolie-Pitt, a girl rescued from the edge of oblivion, now redefining elegance, power, and purpose on her own terms. But what really happened between the orphanage and the red carpet? How did she go from one of the world's most vulnerable children to a young woman shaping global conversations in fashion, activism, and identity? And why is everyone suddenly paying attention to the daughter who once stayed in the background? The answers aren't what you think, because Zahara's journey isn't just inspiring, it's shocking, messy, bold, and it's only just getting started. Before the headlines, before the Hollywood name, and before she ever touched silk or satin or knew what the word fame meant, Zahara's world was nothing but silence, heat, and hunger. She was born in Ethiopia, a country known for its deep culture and resilience, but also for brutal poverty and one heartbreaking statistic: millions of children abandoned, orphaned, or forgotten. Zahara was one of them. At just a few weeks old, her life was already in crisis. Malnourished and too weak to even cry, she clung to life inside a crowded orphanage in Awassa. The walls were cracked, the air heavy with dust, and food, if any, was rationed thin and fast. Water, medicine, comfort, none of that was guaranteed. And while most babies her age were discovering lullabies, Zahara was discovering survival. For children born into that kind of reality, dreams aren't about becoming famous. They're about living through the day. But even that was slipping away. Her biological mother was gone, or so the story went. Her father, unknown. All that remained was a grandmother trying to survive on less than $10 a month. No roof, no stove, no phone, just a baby, and an impossible choice. That's how Zahara ended up there, left not out of cruelty, but out of love. A love so desperate, it let go, and yet in that quiet, cracked room full of forgotten faces, fate was about to knock. Because just when it looked like the world had turned its back on Zahara, someone else was about to walk in. She wasn't there to adopt, at least not at first. Angelina Jolie was already a mother, raising Maddox, the Cambodian boy she'd adopted 3 years earlier. She was an actress, yes, but far more than that, she was becoming a force in humanitarian work. Where most celebrities offered donations, Jolie offered her presence. On the ground, in the field, hands in the dirt, and heart in the chaos. And that's how she found herself in Ethiopia in 2005. The orphanage in Awassa wasn't on a Hollywood map. It was buried in dust, heat, and the quiet heartbreak of forgotten children. But one child stood out, not because she cried, but because she didn't. A baby girl, 6 months old, eyes impossibly large for a face so thin. She didn't scream or reach out, she just stared. Jolie later described it as a moment that pierced straight through her. A silence that was louder than anything she'd heard, and in that moment, something shifted. She didn't need weeks to decide. She didn't need to wait. Angelina Jolie began the adoption process almost immediately. There was no press release, no headline, just one woman and one baby girl whose lives were about to become intertwined in ways no one could have predicted. But what Jolie didn't know was that behind Zahara's frail body and the reports declaring her an orphan, hidden story was waiting, and soon that story would erupt into something no one, especially not the Jolie-Pitt family, saw coming. The world cheered. The headlines painted it as a fairy tale. Hollywood star saves orphaned baby from one of the poorest corners of the world. And for a moment, it looked like that was all the story would be, but it wasn't. Just months after Zahara's adoption, whispers began to surface, rumors that something had been missed. Then, in a twist that sent shockwaves through both media and the Jolie-Pitt household, the truth emerged. Zahara's biological mother was still alive. Her name was Menina Dawit, and her story shattered the illusion of a simple rescue. In a rare interview, Menina shared what really happened. She hadn't abandoned her daughter without feeling. She had been assaulted, violently and silently, by a man she couldn't name and couldn't stop. In her culture, speaking out about such trauma is dangerous. Shame follows the victim, not the attacker. So when she became pregnant, she carried in silence. And when Zahara was born, she had no home, no job, no support. She gave her baby to her own mother, Zahara's grandmother, praying someone else could keep her alive. By the time Jolie appeared, Menina had already let go. Not because she didn't care, but because no one had ever cared for her. The news sparked an international debate. Had Angelina adopted a child who wasn't legally an orphan? Was the process flawed or worse, manipulated? Tabloids leapt at the story. Some falsely claimed Zahara would be returned. Others accused Jolie of exploiting poverty for publicity. But inside the family, there was no scandal. There was only clarity and compassion. Angelina made one thing clear. Zahara would never be taken from her again. But her story, all of it, would be honored. The pain, the past, the people she came from. Because Zahara didn't come from nothing. She came from survival. And now, with her new name and her new life, she was about to become something no one expected. Not just adopted, but unstoppable. One day, she was lying in a metal crib in rural Ethiopia. The next, she was waking up in a mansion in Beverly Hills. No transition, no preparation, just a straight line from nothing to everything. Zahara Jolie-Pitt's new life came with an entourage, private jets, red carpets, photographers camped outside the gates. Her baby photos weren't just for family albums. They were front-page tabloid fodder. The world watched her before she could even walk, but behind the glam, there was a girl growing up in a family unlike any other. Her new parents weren't just famous, they were the most watched couple on Earth. Brad Pitt had officially adopted her, giving her the double-barreled name, Zahara Jolie-Pitt. And with it came a global identity and instant recognition. Still, love isn't a shield. Not from headlines, not from the cameras. From the moment she arrived, Zahara was followed, not by playmates, but by paparazzi. Every outing, every expression, every stumble was captured, sold, and dissected. And then came the cruelest twist. Some tabloids began to spin a fake narrative, claiming the Jolie-Pitt family was planning to send Zahara back to Ethiopia. It was pure fiction, but it hurt. Not just because it was false, but because it fed into a darker narrative, one that saw adopted children as trends, not people. Inside the home, though, Zahara was thriving. She wasn't just loved, she was celebrated. Angelina and Brad raised their children like citizens of the world. Books, languages, music, and culture flowed freely through the house. One day, Paris, the next Cambodia, the next Tokyo. It was less of a Hollywood childhood and more of a global education. But Zahara wasn't just absorbing the world. She was beginning to shape her place in it. By the time most kids were learning to tie their shoes, Zahara was sitting front row at film premieres, walking through art galleries, and hearing her name spoken in languages she didn't yet understand. She had survived famine, she had dodged obscurity. Now she was stepping into something rare, a life with no blueprint and a future she'd soon begin writing herself. The Jolie-Pitts weren't just a family, they were a movement. A tribe pulled together from different continents, languages, and histories, all under one famously protective roof. In a world where children are often raised to blend in, Zahara grew up in a home designed to stand out. She had 6 siblings, some biological, some adopted, but there were no divisions, only names, nicknames, inside jokes, and a constant movement. And yet, even in a family filled with world-famous faces, Zahara had a presence all her own. Elegant, observant, and quietly magnetic, she rarely chased the spotlight, but it always found her anyway. Her bond with Shiloh, her younger sister, by just over a year, became something of a legend among fans. The two were inseparable, not just in photos, but in energy. They shared clothes, games, inside looks, and even the soccer field. Where Zahara led with quiet poise, Shiloh followed with boundless spirit. But Zahara's impact on her family ran deeper than sibling closeness. When she was just 12, something unexpected happened. She started asking questions, real, pointed, childlike questions with adult weight behind them. Why aren't you and Dad married? For years, Jolie and Pitt had avoided the institution altogether. But now their kids were old enough to notice and to want more. Zahara wasn't just part of the conversation, she was the reason it changed. Her voice, alongside her siblings, led to one of Hollywood's most talked about engagements. And in 2014, when Jolie and Pitt finally said, "I do," in a private ceremony in France, it was Zahara who walked down the aisle in a delicate dress, scattering petals as a flower girl. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a moment designed by the children themselves. A ceremony built around unity, not tradition. Love, not legacy. By then, Zahara had grown tall, graceful, and quietly commanding. She may not have been the loudest, but when she moved, the room noticed. She wasn't born into royalty, she became it on her own terms, in a family that made history simply by existing. But her story was far from over, because while most people her age were learning who they were, Zahara was already starting to redefine who she wanted to be. Most children don't revisit the place where they were abandoned. Zahara did, before she even turned 5. In 2009, Angelina Jolie boarded a plane to Ethiopia, not for a film shoot or political summit, but for something deeply personal. She was taking Zahara back to her roots. It wasn't a press stunt, there were no red carpets, no interviews. Just a mother and daughter returning to a place that held both pain and origin. For Zahara, it was the first time she stepped back onto the soil that birthed her. For Angelina, it was a promise fulfilled. But this trip wasn't just about closure. It was about planting something new. Jolie was scouting land for a medical center in Zahara's name. A clinic focused on treating HIV and tuberculosis, 2 diseases that had ravaged communities across Ethiopia for decades. This wasn't charity for the cameras, it was legacy in motion. A chance for Zahara's story to mean something beyond survival. Even at such a young age, Zahara wasn't just present, she was engaged. And that early exposure to purpose, to advocacy, began shaping how she saw herself in the world. Her mother made sure of it. Every family trip, whether to Asia, Africa, or Europe, wasn't just about vacations, it was education in motion. Each child, including Zahara, learned the histories of their own cultures. And the stories of their siblings, too. It was Jolie's way of ensuring no child grew up detached from where they came from. Years later, when Zahara was a teenager, Angelina spoke at a Time 100 talk. Her voice wavered, not from nerves, but from emotion. "She's not just my daughter," she said. "She's an extraordinary African woman." And with that, she acknowledged a truth she could never claim as her own. Zahara's connection to her homeland was deeper, older, and more sacred than anything fame could touch. It belonged solely to Zahara, and she was just beginning to step into it. For most teens, growing up means surviving high school and awkward phases. For Zahara Jolie-Pitt, it meant surviving paparazzi, public scrutiny, and the collapse of one of the most famous marriages in the world. In 2016, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, once seen as Hollywood's ultimate power couple, separated. What followed wasn't just a breakup. It was a war in slow motion, court documents, custody hearings, accusations, delays, reversals, played out not behind closed doors, but across headlines. And caught in the middle, Zahara, just 14 years old. One week, the judge granted Brad Pitt more time with the kids. The next, that decision was reversed when the judge was removed from the case. The media circled like vultures, picking apart every quote, every photo. But through all of it, Zahara remained a mystery the press couldn't crack. She didn't lash out, she didn't perform for attention, she didn't let herself become a tabloid character. She stayed steady. While chaos swirled outside the gates, Zahara walked to class, joined family outings, and began quietly crafting her own identity. Her style grew sharper, more defined. Her posture straightened. She smiled less for the cameras, but when she did, it wasn't forced. Even Brad Pitt, in the few comments he made publicly, expressed concern for the children's emotional well-being. He saw what the custody battle could do. But what the world saw in Zahara was something stronger than reaction. It was restraint, composure, and a kind of quiet power that felt far older than her age. At 14, she wasn't just navigating adolescence. She was enduring a legal and emotional storm with elegance. And while her family name was plastered across every tabloid rack, Zahara herself remained untouched. Because while the media tried to define her by her last name, she was already learning how to define herself by something far more unshakable: grace. She had every reason to fade into the background, a child of celebrities, a survivor of scandal, but Zahara didn't fade, she flourished. By the time she was 17, she wasn't just growing up in fashion, she was creating it. In 2019, Zahara stunned the red carpet, not as a guest, but as a designer. She debuted her own fine jewelry line, the Zahara Collection, in collaboration with famed jeweler Robert Prokop. The designs, sleek, bold, purposeful. This wasn't glitter for attention, it was elegance with meaning. Each piece reflected personal growth, strength, and sophistication beyond her years. And in true Jolie-Pitt tradition, Zahara didn't just design for beauty. She designed for change. A portion of the proceeds supported causes close to her heart, blending fashion with philanthropy. But jewelry was only the beginning. When Angelina launched Atelier Jolie, a fashion house rooted in upcycling, ethics, and diversity, Zahara wasn't behind the scenes. She was in the scenes, not as a mascot, not as a marketing tool, as a collaborator. Inside Atelier's Manhattan headquarters, once the creative haven of Andy Warhol, Zahara helped make decisions that shaped the brand's direction. She reviewed fabrics, she contributed to designs, she gave feedback not as a teenager playing dress-up, but as a young woman with vision. One moment stood out. While reviewing the brand's nude slip dress line, Zahara noticed a gap, literally. The shade range didn't reflect the diversity she believed in, so she spoke up, pushed for change, and got it. The line expanded, embracing more skin tones and honoring inclusivity, not just as a buzzword, but as a lived value. Her voice had weight, and more importantly, it was being heard. Zahara was no longer just growing up in the spotlight. She was designing what the spotlight would look like next. And for the first time, the world wasn't looking at her as Angelina's daughter. They were looking at her as Zahara, the visionary. By now, most people had finally stopped calling her Angelina's adopted daughter. Because Zahara had something far more powerful than fame, a voice, and she was ready to use it. In 2022, Zahara made a move that surprised even longtime followers of the Jolie-Pitt family. She enrolled at Spelman College, one of America's most prestigious historically Black women's institutions, a campus steeped in culture, history, and empowerment. It wasn't just a college decision, it was a statement. Zahara wasn't trying to run from her roots or reinvent herself as someone else. She was doubling down on who she was, an African-born, globally raised young woman reclaiming the narrative of her identity. When Angelina posted the announcement, it wasn't with press agents or glam shots. It was a simple, heartfelt message. A photo of Zahara beaming beside her fellow Spelman freshman. just one of many, a sister among sisters. But while many freshmen were still unpacking dorm boxes and navigating campus maps, Zahara was already doing something few college students ever do. She was walking the halls of Congress. That same year, she joined her mother on a 2-day visit to Washington, D.C. Not for a tour, but for a mission. They were there to advocate for the Justice for All Reauthorization Act, a critical piece of legislation aimed at protecting victims of violent crimes. The issue? Access to legal reports and evidence, resources survivors often struggle to obtain. Zahara sat in meetings with lawmakers, listening, speaking, advocating, not as a celebrity guest, as a citizen with purpose. But this wasn't her first time on Capitol Hill. The year before, she had already made the trip to support the Violence Against Women Act, joining grassroots organizers and policymakers to fight for protections that too often leave out women of color, LGBTQ+ survivors, and rural communities. She wasn't handed a script. She didn't pose for sound bites. She stood there calm, poised, determined. And that's when people began to realize Zahara's activism wasn't a shadow of her mother's, it was her own. After the trip, Angelina shared a candid photo of the two mid-conversation, mid-mission. In the caption, she didn't gush or glorify. She simply honored what Zahara had already become. A voice, a witness, a woman who didn't need attention, only impact. And for once, the spotlight wasn't chasing Zahara, it was following her lead. She entered the world nameless, fragile, forgotten. Now she walks with legacy on her shoulders and purpose in her steps. In 2021, Zahara Jolie-Pitt made an appearance that silenced red carpet critics and delighted fashion historians. At the premiere of Eternals, she wore a dress, but not just any dress. It was a shimmering silver Elie Saab couture gown, the same one her mother wore to the Oscars in 2014. On Angelina, it had once symbolized Hollywood royalty. On Zahara, it became something else entirely. Not just a hand-me-down, but a handoff, a passing of power, a statement that she was no longer just part of the story. She was the story. The moment sent a quiet shockwave through social media. Here was Zahara, graceful and poised, taking a piece of history and making it her own. She wasn't mimicking her mother, she was reinterpreting her legacy and giving it new meaning. Behind the scenes, she had already begun studying French, fashion's unofficial second language. And the rumors started swirling. Would Zahara dive deeper into design, into activism, into politics? Maybe all three. Because Zahara doesn't just belong in one world, she belongs to many. She is the daughter of trauma and triumph, the product of two continents, a child who grew up with cameras in her face, but clarity in her eyes. And now, standing at the intersection of heritage, creativity, and power, Zahara is becoming exactly what she was never expected to be, herself. She's not chasing fame, she's shaping conversations. Not just wearing brands, but building them. Not just walking in her mother's footsteps, but carving her own path through them. So where does Zahara go from here? Maybe the better question is, how far will the world let her lead?